By 1986, the Sandinista revolution was in disarray. But the Contras were also in trouble. With reports of their human rights violations mounting, the U.S. Congress banned the government from providing funds for the rebels, setting the stage for the biggest scandal of the Reagan administration, the Iran-Contra affair. Determined to continue their funding of the Contras, U.S. officials sold arms to Iran in exchange for the release of U.S. hostages and millions of dollars. This cash, in turn, was funneled to the 23,000-strong Contra army. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, a member of the U.S. National Security Council, played a key role in establishing the covert network.
And I don't like the insinuation that I'm up here having a convenient memory lapse like perhaps some others have had.
I think that Oliver North was a true zealot. He was a true believer. He thought they were in an historic apocalyptic struggle against the communist world, and they had to fight to the death in Nicaragua. And these Democrats on Capitol Hill were all weak-kneed and soft on communism. And so he had to save the United States all by himself.
I'm going to save any comments till the whole hearing is.
President Reagan survived the scandal, claiming memory loss.
I'm having some trouble remembering that.
We did not, repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages, nor will we. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
But the episode sounded the death knell for the Contras. And the decade of strife had also taken its toll on the Sandinistas. The Nicaraguan people were exhausted from war, economic turmoil, and confrontation with each other and the United States. It was against this backdrop that Ortega made good on his promise to compete in free elections. He was voted out in favor of a broad alliance led by Violeta Chamorro.
So the results of that election were unexpected. We wanted to win, we expected to win, and it was very hard to assimilate the results and for them to really sink in. But we didn't think twice about accepting the results.
Gracious in defeat, the Sandinistas had proven even their fiercest critics wrong.
The day which the Sandinist Front recognized that we have lost the elections and that Mrs. Chamorro had won the election, it was a great day for democracy in Nicaragua.
It had been 10 years since the Sandinista revolution, but as Daniel Ortega acknowledged defeat in the Plaza of the Revolution, he made a vow.
We're used to fighting from the bottom. We're used to fighting our torturers, our jailers. And now that there is a revolutionary people's power in Nicaragua, we are better positioned to very soon return to govern this country from the top.
But when the Sandinistas left office, they did not leave empty-handed. They changed the law and joined the landed gentry that they had spent so long opposing.
They passed 2 laws to accelerate the legalization of property that had already been distributed. Much of it was fair, but these laws were used and manipulated to benefit a certain group. That was the basis for what is now the new Sandinista capital.
Many were outraged by the laws that allowed many Sandinistas to enrich themselves while their countrymen were in ruins. But the new Chamorro government had more pressing matters to think about. The war was over, but Nicaragua was bankrupt and in tatters. The new government began the task of disarmament. The new U.S. President, George Bush Sr., even participated in this ceremony. The event marked the passing of a tragic era and ushered in a new beginning. Yet Daniel Ortega knew that people still dreamed of the social justice his revolution had offered. And no sooner had he been voted out of power than he began planning his return.
Today, Daniel Ortega represents the ambition for personal accumulation of power. Ortega started as a revolutionary leader, but has turned into a traditional populist.
He remained head of the Sandinista party and became leader of the opposition bloc in Congress. He used his influence to negotiate shady deals with political enemies, even if it meant breaking with his closest comrades. His former vice president, novelist Sergio Ramirez, founded a breakaway party called the Sandinista Renovation Movement.
I think we split because I was on the side of democratic procedures, and Daniel believed that we must recuperate power at any price. At any price, even against the law, even against the Constitution.
And you, as a founder of the Sandinista movement, find that apparently very repulsive.
Of course, because the Sandinista front was based on principles, on ethical principles.
By 1997, Ortega was using his power in Congress to strike deals with the right-wing ruling party. Each needed the other to form a majority in Congress that allowed them to reform the Constitution and share control of key institutions, the judiciary, the Comptroller General's office, and the Electoral Council. The right-wing president, Arnoldo Alemán, was widely denounced, even by Ortega, for widespread corruption, reminiscent of an earlier era.
The Somoza dictatorship had more than 40 years to accumulate wealth, but in less than 6 years, Alemán became a multi-millionaire.
After leaving office, Alemán was tried and sentenced to 20 years in prison for swindling millions of dollars from the state coffers. Ortega used his influence in the courts to get him out of jail and later to have him acquitted at a price.
In exchange, Ortega altered the electoral law, allowing him to win an election in the first round with just 35% of the vote, something unprecedented in Latin America.
Only one thing was missing: the political support of former Contra Cardinal Obando y Bravo, and through him, the crucial backing of the Catholic Church. But this backing was assured only when Ortega passed socially conservative legislation outlawing abortion. Although he had never expressed any interest in religion in the 1980s, Ortega asked the cardinal to renew his marriage vows with Rosario Murillo, his wife and campaign manager. For many, this was the confirmation that Ortega had sold out.
Sí, pero bueno, ahí está, pues, y entonces los que estábamos en ese tiempo, ¿verdad? Ahora no estamos ahí.
The cardinal was the spiritual leader of the Contras. Now it turns out that those of us who were with Ortega in the beginning are now the enemies. The oligarchs and the cardinal and the vice president, etc., are the great personalities of our national life.
The vast majority of the original Sandinista leadership denounced Ortega as a traitor to their cause. But not Eden Pastora, perhaps the ultimate pragmatist, who returned to Ortega's camp.
To take power, you have to make deals with Satan.
Even if it means making a pact with the devil?
With Mr. Satan, if that's what you have to do. It's worse to go to war, to kill people. But what is more moral? To make a deal or to kill? That's politics. It is justified if you use power correctly. Politics isn't clean. It's not made by angels or saints.
Further evidence of Ortega's political transformation was provided by his choice of running mate for the 2006 presidential elections, former Contra leader Jaime Morales Carazo. The Sandinista leader had successfully secured the backing of former foes, whether Contras or Catholics, and he also gained the backing of the electorate, but barely, with little more than 37% of the vote, less than what he obtained in his 3 previous failed attempts at re-election. Though reconciliation was one of Ortega's key electoral themes in 2006, for most Nicaraguans, the reconciliation process had taken years, as people have tried to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. These mountains were the front line of the war, the northern front, where most of the fiercest fighting took place. The Contras used to come here from over those hills, just across the border with Honduras, where they had their base camps. And when we would go into the villages around here, we would usually find people mourning their dead. Today, the same people who were fighting each other have learned to live together. People like Santos Cosme Martinez. He was wounded by shrapnel while fighting the Contras.
They were very cruel. If they found you, they would spear you with their bayonets. They'd cut your throat. They did what they wanted with the women. But you know, both sides sought revenge. Whatever you do, I'll do better. It was war.
But the 20 years that have passed have healed more than just his wounds. Now he laughs and talks about baseball with his neighbor, Victor Romero, a former Contra.
No, to kill one another isn't worth it. To run around killing each other is shameful. We're all humans after all.
The situation has changed. We are no longer enemies. We see each other as brothers of peace. We are all the same now.
The former fighters are united not only in peace, but by poverty. Like the majority of Nicaraguans, they continue to suffer the hardship that many had dreamed of eradicating with the revolution. But it's a very different story for some of the revolution's architects. Today, Daniel Ortega's brother, Humberto, the former Sandinista defense minister, is a wealthy businessman. And other ex-Sandinista leaders own large amounts of real estate, financial institutions, and telecommunications companies. It seems revolutionary fervor has been replaced by a war-weary pragmatism.
We have a vocation in favor of the poor. We want power to take the poor out of poverty. But the Sandinista Party is not the order of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. It never has been.
Arce was one of the most left-leaning comandantes of the revolution. But he is now Nicaragua's largest importer of rice, the country's staple food. It's a food upon which Esperanza and her young family depend.
We only have rice today. Beans are too expensive now. If I have rice, that's what I give my children. But if not, imagine, sometimes we just sit like this, looking at each other's faces.
Esperanza's family lives in the shadow of Managua's main square, where the Sandinistas first celebrated their victory in 1979. It still bears the scars of a 1972 earthquake that destroyed the capital, including its beautiful cathedral. Dozens of families made homeless by the disaster have lived in this former laboratory ever since. Esperanza's home is this tiny shack tacked on to the main building. She shares one bed with her 5 children.
Hola. I sleep here, the other there, and the youngest sleeps with me in my arms.
Like Esperanza, most of the urban poor's survival depends on finding casual work. Today she's lucky. Help is needed unloading a watermelon truck at a nearby market.
$4 is what they pay for a whole day's work. That's enough to pay for one day's food for the family. Tomorrow, I have to search again for a way to make ends meet.
Nicaragua has become the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere after Haiti. Half the population lives in acute poverty. 1 out of every 3 children suffers from chronic malnutrition. But in many ways, modern-day Managua is no different from other capital cities in the region, with its casinos, multinationals, and modern infrastructure. And American influence is once again pervasive in the form of dozens of fast food outlets dotted around the city.
The criticism from those of us on the left is that despite Ortega's anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist rhetoric, his administration is absolutely free market, exactly the same as previous conservative governments.
Yet Ortega still calls himself a revolutionary. He likes to be seen alongside Latin America's leftist leaders. He has renewed relations with Moscow and initiated ties with Iran. But perhaps significantly, pink is now his favorite color, as chosen by his wife Rosario for all official advertisements, to show that the Sandinistas are no longer red. And mindful of the power of big business, he has also watered down his principles. For more than 3 months, some 400 sugarcane cutters who worked for Nicaragua's richest family, the owners of Flor de Caña rum, have been camped out along this highway. They claim their health has been damaged by pesticides used in the cane fields, and now they are demanding compensation.
We can't afford kidney transplants. Do you know how much that costs? Yesterday, another one of us died. He was here and died of renal failure. The labor law stipulates that workers affected by this disease should be compensated.
But the government is not enforcing it, claiming they're caught between a rock and a hard place.
Estabilidad macroeconómica, hay que mantenerla. Y la hemos mantenido.
We want to maintain macroeconomic stability. We'll sit down with the IMF if there's no choice. If we expropriate the Pella family business, then we're communists. If we try to work with him, then we're bourgeois.
Yet despite all the compromises, the billboards over Revolutionary Square boast of 30 years of keeping promises. It's a bold statement, but some would argue that Ortega has continued to deliver on some of these promises, with a little help from his friends.
Someone like Chavez comes and helps us because he has oil and a Bolivarian mentality. We have to be grateful to Chavez, and the first one to be grateful has to be Daniel.
Venezuelan generosity with oil donations has allowed Ortega to generate enough electricity to eliminate daily blackouts. With aid money from the European Union and the United States, roads are being paved in rural mountain areas. But perhaps the strongest reminder of the old days can be found in these classrooms. In the mountains of Matagalpa in northern Nicaragua, farm workers take evening literacy classes. First the women, then the men, after they've come back from the coffee fields. After the Sandinistas lost power, illiteracy levels soared to more than 35%. Now the government hopes to eliminate it by the end of the year.
It's good to learn so that no one can cheat or deceive you. When you work and it's time to get paid, you don't know if they're shortchanging you, because I couldn't count properly.
But cheating is precisely what President Daniel Ortega is now being accused of. Following allegations of widespread voter fraud in 2008 municipal elections.
What happened is extremely grave because if there was one major contribution of the Sandinista revolution, something the nation inherited in 1990, it was the confidence in the electoral system, and that was destroyed with the fraud that took place last November.
Ortega is said to have used his control of the Electoral Council and the judiciary to gain at least 40 municipal districts, prompting the United States and the European Union to suspend more than $100 million worth of desperately needed aid. Even though the elections were late last year, the people here are still demanding a recount. They say this is much more than about the legitimacy of the current government, but rather about defending a democracy that so many people in this country fought and died for when they overthrew the Somoza dictatorship 30 years ago.
We the youth, we want our vote back. We won't allow a bunch of thieves to punish us. That's why we're on the street. No to Ortega's dictatorship.
But Ortega is ignoring all criticism. Instead, he's made it clear he intends to remain in power even after his term ends in 2012, by once again reforming the Constitution, this time to allow unlimited consecutive terms, another sinister echo of the past.
The great problem in our country is the role that re-elections have played in the domination of dictatorships. You have to learn from your history so you don't repeat it. Somoza, for example, held elections, playing at the democratic game, but they were a fraud.
In one of the very rare interviews he has given since returning to power, Ortega confirmed his plans to Al Jazeera.
And I support completely that position that the people should have the right to elect the candidate of their choice. And these obstacles should not be set up to deny them that right. Now that we're back in government, if conditions permit, yes, I would run again for president. And if those conditions were not present, I would be fine exercising as prime minister and then once again running for president.
In order to change the Constitution, Ortega will yet again need the support of the main opposition party in Congress. But their leader insists that this time there will be no deal. Can you assure me here and now that you would not support the re-election of Daniel Ortega?
A continuous re-election and a parliamentary system? No.
Many don't believe him and say he has said he would oppose Ortega many times before, only to capitulate.
Arnoldo Alemán is going to facilitate the reform of the Constitution in the moment Daniel Ortega needs it by allowing some of the members of the Liberal Party to vote for the political reforms.
And unlike Venezuela's President Hugo Chavez and Bolivia's Evo Morales, Ortega has no plans to call a referendum to ask his people if they agree, further alienating his traditional support base. El Nuevo Diario was one of two staunchly pro-Sandinista newspapers during the 80s. Now it warns of the consequences of allowing Ortega to fulfill his ambition of perpetuating power. Danilo Aguirre says his son fought and died during the Sandinista uprising 30 years ago to stop leaders from keeping power.
Nicaragua shed torrents of blood to stop re-elections. I've seen people die on the street saying no to re-elections, no to dynastic succession. That's why we fought Somoza. Here, re-election has only brought us misery.
Years ago, when the Sandinistas rid their country of a monstrous dictatorship, the dream of a free, prosperous, and democratic Nicaragua inspired the country and the world. But now the clock seems to be turning back, a sad reminder that the promise of that revolution remains unfulfilled.